Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar. My name is Jordan Stark and I'm part of the marketing team at Canadian Fertility Consulting and Egg Helpers, and I'm happy to be here with our speakers today to talk about legal considerations for egg donation. Before we get started, and while I wait for a few more attendees to join us, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items. Number one is that we know that everyone is at home right now, so in the event that you have any internet connection issues, please call in using a phone. You can call in using the phone number that is in your registration email so that you can still participate. Item number two is that we would like you to be aware that we are recording this webinar today, and everyone who has registered will be sent a direct link to watch this again later, along with the contact information about consultations with our speakers. And last but not least, we are encouraging everyone on this webinar today to please ask questions if you have them using the questions feature for GoToWebinar. Now we have a lot to cover, so let's get started. Here with our speakers today, we have lawyer Cindy Wasser of Hope Springs Fertility Law in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. After almost 25 years as Canada's top criminal defense lawyer, Cindy Wasser thought she was retiring in 2008 to become a mother through surrogacy to the first of her two beautifully created daughters. Driven by her difficult journey along the path to parenthood, she instead founded Hope Springs Fertility Law to guide, protect, and advocate for everyone creating families with the help of donors and surrogates. We also have Leia Swanberg with us. Leia is founder and CEO of Egg Helpers and CFC. She is located in Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. Leia is a mother to five and a two-time gestational surrogate and a six-time egg donor. She began Egg Helpers in 2007 after her second surrogacy with the intention of creating a more rewarding surrogacy experience for both intended parents and surrogates, as well as for egg donors and intended parents. With a background in business development and management, Leia turned her personal passion for alternative family building into a full-time business. I'll now invite Leia on screen. Hi, Leia.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. One of my greatest passions, aside from my own family, is helping others to build theirs. Egg donation came to me after I had sort of had a few kids of my own and had been a surrogate, and absolutely was a life-changing experience for me. I continued on to donate a total of 6 times, and each donation was quite different for me. I have been a known donor where I had met and knew the intended parents going into the donation. I have been an anonymous donor with open ID, so meaning that in the future I would allow my information to be relayed to any child or children that would result. And I've also been part of anonymous donations. And for me, the gift was in donating, and there were no strings attached to that gift. So my comfort level of being known or in an anonymous donation really was about the comfort level of the recipients, those people who were receiving my eggs. At the time when I started donating, there really wasn't so much of a legal consideration. So during my first 2 donations, I didn't have legal agreements. It just wasn't a thing yet. And I think as the industry has moved forward and as laws have been developed, our hope is, as egg helpers, is that all of our intended parents and donors feel safe, protected, and understand the roles and responsibilities of all parties moving through this process, whether it is the legal requirements of the donor's age, whether it is the type of contact that the donor or intended parents commit to in the future, whether it is around the donor or recipients providing information back to their lawyer or us as an agency on gender, date of birth, and city of birth of future children to ensure that there's that added layer of separation between children. And so for me, each year I learn more about an industry I am so deeply passionate about. Each year, lawyers tell me more, and I become more curious. And just as I didn't have an agreement those first 2 donations, in subsequent donations I did, and I felt more secure. I felt safer. I, you know, did it change my wanting to participate in egg donation, whether there was an agreement or not? It didn't. However, I know that the best practice as I carried on through my donations was to have a contract, was to ensure I understood the 10-page consent form that I signed as a donor. I know many of the participants on today's call are donors, and I just want to tell you, from one donor to another, it may sound like a big deal, and there are parts of a legal contract that absolutely are so important and a big deal. But the lawyers we work with are going to walk you through that process, or the lawyers you work with if you're donating to friends or family or privately. The lawyers are able to explain things, ensure that items that they may not have ever thought of but are important to you are included in an agreement. And that's why, for me, I have Cindy Wasser on this webinar. She's a lawyer who handles egg donation agreements either for intended parents or for egg donors. She works on both sides. She understands both sides, not only from just a professional perspective, but she, I'm sure, will explain that she is a mother through egg donation. So her and I both take very different approaches because we both have come from a different perspective, but we found this common ground, which really values egg donors and the participation and the amazing gift you are giving to people, as well as intended parents, ensuring that they feel supported, protected, and encouraged as they move through the process. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Cindy. Thank you again, Cindy, for participating in this webinar.
Thank you, Leah. It is such a pleasure. I'm so honored that you would have me, and thank you for the lovely introduction, Jordan. So I'd like to start off from the legal perspective by telling you that there's actually no legal requirement in Canada to have an egg donor contract. So if some of you want to hang up now, go ahead. But if you'd like to stay and find out why we're having this webinar and why you might want a contract, you might find it really interesting. As both Jordan and Leah mentioned, I am a mother through egg donation. I met my husband at 42 years old and discovered, unfortunately, that I was already too late to make my babies. And so we went through the process back then, because my oldest is now 11. And I was a criminal defense lawyer when I started, as Jordan mentioned. And so I had never read the legislation involving egg donation and surrogacy in Canada. And when I did read it at that time, I was frankly quite appalled. It's not well written, and there were a lot of questions I had with respect to the meaning of certain words and the prohibitions. And so I want to start by talking about those things. In Canada, we have an altruistic program for donation and surrogacy. And with respect to the donation aspect, which is today's topic, it says essentially that one may not purchase eggs from a person. So you cannot offer to purchase, you cannot purchase. There's actually no prohibition against selling the eggs. So people who need an egg donor or a sperm donor cannot purchase from them. Agencies, however, have developed in Canada, such as Leia's agency, as an example, to provide a service. And the consulting service is perfectly legal. They arrange the whole journey for you. They help find donors. They introduce them to resources such as lawyers and doctors, and they manage your journey as well. They introduce intended parents to doctors and lawyers. They manage the whole reimbursement matter, and they manage the entire process. For that, they're entitled to have a fee. From the perspective of the donor, there is nothing illegal with getting paid. It is illegal for the intended parent to pay. It is illegal for the agency to pay. And so when the legislation in Canada developed back in 2004 that said one may not purchase eggs or sperm, it also had a section that actually never came into enforcement. And that section said that donors, as well as surrogates, but donors could be reimbursed for their expenses as long as they provided a receipt for the expense that they incurred, as well as evidence of the expense. And it had to be related to the journey, of course. And the expenses themselves had to be in accordance with regulations. But those regulations never happened until now. So as of June 9th this year, coming up, we have a new provision in our law that sets out what a donor specifically may receive. And the list is pretty exhaustive. When Parliament, or when the Health Canada decided to create the regulations, they did reach out to everyone in the industry, and many of us submitted documents, went to roundtables, and discussed what we understood from experience were the relevant expenses that a donor might need. And of course, there was always a fear that perhaps we hadn't thought of something in a given case. Where do we go? What do we do if something new happens? And so along with the regulations, Health Canada published a document called a guidance document. And the guidance document tells us that even though we haven't set out something in particular, it doesn't mean it's illegal to reimburse the donor for that. If it's related to the donation, if she has a receipt or he has a receipt for it, and as well with the regulations, there needs to be a declaration saying all of this information, then it may very well be perfectly fine to reimburse the donor for that expense. And in a little while, I'm going to go through the actual expenses themselves. And so what I can say about this is that Health Canada has taken an approach that a donor should never be out of pocket for the expense, and that anything that is reasonably related to the donation will be considered an appropriate expense as long as the donor can swear a declaration saying, I did spend this, and has a receipt where a receipt is available. And so for that reason, there shouldn't be a problem with respect to the financial aspects of it. The other issue is, of course, the contract. So a lot of people, as Leia said, start by asking, do we need to do a contract with our donor? And as I started this discussion, the answer is not in Canada. It's not mandatory. Surrogacy contracts are, but not egg donor contracts. And so I'd like to explain why you might think that you should do one or give consideration to that. So I went through the process. And when I did so, my lawyer told me that I did not need a contract. And of course, we didn't think that we should bother doing one if that was the case. And just as my surrogate was getting pregnant, my mother was diagnosed with fatal kidney cancer. And so when I relayed this to my own physician later, she said, well, it's not a highly genetic cancer, but you warrant having a full body scan. And so I get a full body scan every couple of years to monitor cysts as they come and go. But that made me think about my children. What if their donor had or developed a fatal cancer in the future? My mother was 79. What if their donor did? So would my children get proper medical care like I was getting? Who would know? And then as my children got older, and I have 2 daughters, there were other things I had to think about as a parent. One was, of course, their female health, their reproductive health. So I'm obviously not the youngest person in the room, but, oh, actually I am in this room, but I'm not the youngest out there. So I've gone through menopause. And as I went through that, I had to think about sharing the symptoms with my daughter, only my symptoms were irrelevant to them. Did we have the donor symptoms? When they would go through menopause, would they know what their donor went through? Would they know if she, God forbid, became sick in the future? All of these questions developed. And then another question developed, which was, what if the donor has other children, her own children? What if she makes children for other families? These are offspring from my children. These are related offspring. These are half siblings. And as my children got older, wouldn't they want to know if they have brothers or sisters out in the world? Did it offend me to give them that information? And I, like so many of the women I speak to at the beginning of this journey, worried about whether I would be considered or feel like the real mother. And what was interesting about that is when I chose to share those feelings with my husband, he shared with me that he worried the same things, even though he was biological. And so I think all people worry when they're making a child through reproductive technologies about the lack of connection, and whether you're a same-sex couple, whether you will also feel these things. But what I can tell you is my experience, and that of all of my clients, is that the moment you hold that baby, you know you're the parent and nothing can come between you. And so we decided, thinking about all of these things in the future, that we would want our donor to be known to us so that we would get that information. And looking back on it, I wish we had a contract. I think we're lucky because our donor is so respectful and so wonderful that we can get the information from her moving forward. But as a lawyer, and when I became a fertility lawyer after my daughter's birth, I really thought that this was an important legal element to the journey. And it was actually with Leia and her husband, Scott, that I sat down with and said, as you develop this company, Egg Helpers, please give consideration to taking it as a holistic approach to the legals as well. And think about the age of this woman who donates. Generally, donors are fairly young, and it's an incredible gift. But shouldn't they have legal advice before they do it? Shouldn't they talk about the consequences of a gift that never stops giving? Shouldn't they know that their health will always have an important role to play in the offspring that they create? And all of those things seemed important as a parent and important to me as a lawyer. But I wanted to make the process as streamlined and simple as possible because it's not legally mandatory either. And so a 10-page contract is what we came up with. We shared that with a number of other really good lawyers in the industry. Everybody had input so that they could say, yes, we could recommend these terms and streamline it. There wouldn't be any back and forth, and we could do it really quickly and for reduced legal fees. And so there are very good reasons for doing the contract, which really is not time consuming or terribly expensive. So it includes mutual disclosure of relevant medical information, mutual disclosure of the gender and birth date of all offspring, so that everybody knows that there's a little boy or girl out there with this particular birth date. And as our children grow up, we need to keep that list handy, because those children who match that gender and birth date that ours may meet need to be off limits for a little bit in case romantic inclinations develop. And a lot of people don't think about that going into the journey. And so it may just be a question of, speaking to the other child's parents and questioning who they are and whether, there was a donation involved. I meet children who've grown up and are children created through either egg or sperm donation, and they didn't know, and the information isn't available, and they live in fear of dating someone who might turn out to be a sibling. So I think it's important for our children. I suffered tremendously as a woman going through this process. I sought out a great deal of therapy, counseling, alone and with my husband in order to come to terms with this. And I sought the great wisdom of amazing friends who assured me that parenting is long-term and the most important part of this journey. And then I came at it also from the legal perspective. And so when I made the decision to have a known donor and to have access to information with her and to give my children access to her and her information, I did that with a lot of information. And that's information I love to share as a lawyer to my clients. The next part of it, because we did a surrogacy, involved the birth registration process. And I know a lot of people are concerned that when they do register the birth of their child through donation, they're concerned about having to disclose that on any paperwork. So first of all, if you are able to carry the baby yourself as an intended mother, and you register the birth as the mother, there is nowhere where you need to disclose that this was a donation. If you need a surrogate and you register the birth through a surrogate, you do not need to disclose that there was a donation, although there would be disclosure of a surrogate in the paperwork. The actual birth certificate itself does not even mention the surrogate. And so there are a great deal of protections in the provinces of Canada because in general, Canada recognizes the importance of the intention to parent rather than the genetics or biology of parenting. I'd like to share for some of you a little excerpt of the decision that a judge made in the case of my own children's birth registration process, which was a court application called a declaration of parentage. But just so you understand that these children in Canada are to be treated the same as any other child. So if I may take a moment, this is what Justice Trafford said. It is also appropriate to observe on this occasion that the inherent worth and dignity of all persons is of fundamental importance in a free and democratic society like Canada. All lives, whatever the circumstances leading to their conception, are to be respected and recognized as equal before and under the law. And then he names my daughters, Etta and Janelle, are to be respected and are respected as much as any other person. Their lives, in all of their potential, are no different than the lives of any other person. They are as important to the society we live in and treasure as Canadians as any other person. The rule of law in Canada demands such treatment of them and will facilitate the development of their potential as human beings through proceedings like those before the court today. And so, as you can see, there is a recognition here that these children are no different and deserve to be respected under the rule of law. And so with that in mind, there should really be no fear in entering into the process and in entering into a legal contract to protect all of those rights for everybody. And so the contract lists the rights and obligations, which are that the intended parents are the parent. The donor has no legal right as a parent. And that means that the donor does not get to just show up at the doorstep one day and say, that's my child. That doesn't happen. And the donor waives all rights. And when they go to the clinic to do the medical aspect, there are legal consent forms that must be signed there as well. Health Canada mandates that under the law. And those documents also say that the donor is waiving all rights and giving every ova or all the sperm to the clinic for the recipients. So the contract outlines those rights and obligations, also the importance of confidentiality, as well as the issues I raised already about mutual disclosure. And then we like to set out that the fact is that the donor is reimbursed for all expenses that this is an altruistic donation. And that agreement as to what those expenses will usually be between the donor and the agency and the parents in the agency, so they'll know what they can expect. But as of June 9th, the regulations that come into place tell us that these will be considered perfectly acceptable reimbursements. So any expenses for travel, which includes transportation, parking, meals when a donor is at the clinic, for example, and accommodation for those who must stay overnight. And mileage, of course, is always calculated based on Canada Revenue Agency rates, this year 59 cents a kilometer. A donor may have pets or children, so her dependents and pets may need caring for while she's at the clinic, especially those who may fly across the country some distance and stay away from home for almost 2 weeks. So pet care, boarding of the dog, for example, and of course, childcare. Counseling. So before a donor will go into the program, it will be required, although not legally required, for her to have a psychosocial or genetic counseling. And so that may be reimbursed, of course. And of course, the legal services and disbursements for her lawyer is perfectly legal. Any drugs and devices that are required for her. So these may include prescription as well as non-prescription drugs, the natural health products, over-the-counter drugs, antacids, things like that, heartburn drugs, vitamins, minerals, supplements. Sometimes the donor may require Gatorade after the donation. The doctor may recommend that she go on a high salt-based diet. So all of those things could be included here. So any post-retrieval items. And then any products or services that the doctor recommends in writing. So when she does the retrieval and during the cycle monitoring, the doctor may say this donor will require the special diet or any particular items that are not listed in those other items. Sometimes a donor will be told, or in most cases I suspect, that she shouldn't engage in any heavy lifting or activity prior to and post retrieval for a little while. And so if she's being a regular gym goer and pays a monthly membership, she's going to be out of pocket on behalf of the intended parents because she's doing this donation and can't go to the gym. So it may be very well that reimbursement for that loss would be acceptable in that case. Some of these things are not listed in the regulations, and so they're things to discuss in the individual case. Other expenses that may be allowed as well is obviously if she needs medical notes and has to pay doctors to obtain those, or if the agency is paying the doctors, the intended parents should reimburse for those costs. If she needs travel insurance or disability insurance, all insurance is reimbursable. And then there's basically a catch-all. So this guidance document came out and said, look, we can only make regulations based on what information was provided already in the legislation. And so if we've missed anything, as long as it's related, as I said earlier, it may very well be okay to do it. And as an example, they said the law didn't actually provide that donors could get loss of income. And as I said, some donor may come from British Columbia to Toronto and be here for almost 2 weeks for cycle monitoring, or even more than 2 weeks post-retrieval, and she's out of work. So of course, Health Canada said she should be able to receive her loss of income. And even the donor who goes to a local clinic might be out of work for a few hours, depending on the timing of her appointments. So loss of income will be provided for if she can show that she earned the income initially, missed it because of the medical appointments, and of course had the note from the clinic saying this is when the donor was required to be here. Another example of a perfectly legal reimbursement that might not be clear in all cases relates to the donor who's in school. And again, she comes and misses school for 2 weeks and she's in university. She may wish to hire another classmate or friend to take notes for her and help her study to catch up as a tutor. So as long as she can provide a receipt for the cost of paying that note taker, and it was done during the time that she was away from school to do the cycle monitoring and the donation, that may very well be a reasonable expense within the guidelines. And so there is an open-endedness to it that a particular donor may have that others don't, and that can be discussed with the agency. And of course, Hope Springs will always be available to all the agencies to discuss any particular circumstances that come up that aren't actually listed in the legislation. And so that explains the legal aspects of this and what goes into a contract. And some of the more emotional aspects of this. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the process. So once a donor is selected through an agency like Egg Helpers, they have a very particular process to streamline it, which is that the screening normally takes place and then the donor has an appointment with her lawyer to review a draft contract and then sign it. And then we receive that signed contract to review with the intended parents. And so we conduct a full review of it, which usually only takes an hour with both intended parents. And then they can sign it, and we send a legal clearance letter to the clinic saying everyone has signed the contract. So it's fairly streamlined and therefore not inconvenient. And it shouldn't hold up cycles. It shouldn't cost very much. As long as you're working with lawyers and agencies that are really familiar with the process, it's really not that much to ask to consider for protection of your children in the future. I think that about covers everything. I'm open for questions now.
Thank you, Cindy. That was a lot of wonderful information. We do have quite a few questions here for you. We'll try to get through most of them. The first question I have, is the donor agency required to share the test results of a donor, for example, AMH, genetics, psychological assessment, etc., with the recipient, intended parent, before you decide to proceed, or is that strictly confidential and only to be shared with the fertility clinic?
Can I answer that, Cindy?
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Perfect. So that's a fantastic question, and we often rely on the clinics to relay that information to you because there's a lot behind the information. It's not simply a blood test result or an ultrasound result. Often those results can look very different if an egg donor potentially has an IUD or is on the birth control pill or is not on any form of contraceptive. And so even the donor psychological assessment, that would be something that's best to have provided to you by the clinic, although we have the sort of raw data. I think that once you receive the raw data from our agency or another agency on a previous cycle or the donor's medical history, we would then refer you to the nurse that worked with the donor last time or who was responsible for her screening to fill in any of those blanks for you.
And from the legal perspective, you and the donor would likely have signed consent forms at the clinic to relay the relevant information so that you would have it. And of course, and Leia, please correct me if I'm wrong here, if a donor does not pass screening because of a diagnosis discovered, of course, it wouldn't be relevant to tell you what that specific problem was, only that she can't donate or he can't donate. And so you don't need to know why necessarily, and they would maintain some relevant privacy for the donor in that respect.
Absolutely, and that would go for the intended parents as well. Should a donor be matched with intended parents who then subsequently find out that maybe they aren't able to carry themselves or they choose based on some medical results not to move forward, that would be kept strictly confidential by both the clinic and the agency.
Great, thank you. They're also wondering, for a bit more clarification on these tests, are there any legally mandatory tests that the donor is required to undergo, or is it all voluntary?
The clinic will require testing to be done to ensure the suitability of an egg donor. And while it's not a legal requirement, it is a medical requirement. So some requirements are from a medical perspective, so various testing, while the donor's consent form at the clinic is a somewhat of a legal requirement or responsibility that the donor would meet in order to proceed further as a donor. And then Cindy, if there are any items that you've ever seen added to a contract that intended parents wanted to have be a part of the process.
Yes, and also it's important to point out that Health Canada introduced safety regulations that came out in February as well, also after a lot of input from the medical community, fertility clinics in particular, about the testing of eggs and sperm. And so every clinic is required by law to undertake proper care in the testing and in the maintenance of frozen gametes or embryos. And so it's a very extensive and exhaustive list of safety measures that are undertaken. But with respect to the particular list of genetic testing, or because people talk about pre-genetic testing all the time, that is something that you would speak with your individual doctor about to go through what they would do under their program or what else you might want done.
Okay, great, thank you. The next few questions here are from a potential egg donor. They're wondering, are people currently donating, and where could you go in Ontario for egg donation?
Absolutely. So currently with the COVID-19 restrictions, donors are able to sign up with us, to have a consultation with one of our intake team, to register as a donor, and some of the medical testing can be done in your community. And so the clinic will have a Skype or Zoom call with you, with the nurse practitioner, to really go over the process to ensure that while this is a lovely idea, that this is something that you're interested in engaging in. And then you'll have some requisitions for blood work sent to you if there is a laboratory close to you that is open. We have donors going in for the initial blood work. And if you're wanting to wait to meet with the nurse practitioner in the clinical setting and wanting to have your testing done there, we can still register you in our program and move forward from there. In terms of clinics in Ontario, the majority of the clinics that we work with are in Toronto. However, we have outside monitoring and satellite monitoring clinics set up across Ontario. And so you would be able to, be in Toronto for the screening and then do many of the tests and many of the appointments leading up to the egg retrieval in your community, and just travel in for the egg retrieval and an overnight stay to have a follow-up the next day and travel home after that.
Okay, great. Thank you. A few other questions here, just regarding payments and who pays for what. So the tests that are done ahead of donation, does the donor pay for that and then get reimbursed, or how does that part work?
No, so the fertility clinic will pick up the costs for that testing, and our agency and other agencies as well will share that cost out. There's no cost to you to get started. Even those initial tests, those expenses will go back to you from the intended parents that you donate for. And so, please, if you're interested in donating, know that you will not be out of pocket for these expenses associated with the testing or traveling to the testing, whether it's mileage or Uber or the train or the GO train, whatever that looks like. We will make sure that you have those expenses covered as well.
Okay, wonderful. Lots of questions coming in here. Do we have some time for some more questions?
Sure.
So Cindy, back to what you were speaking of the new regulations coming in as June 9th, 2020. Someone has heard that there are also new regulations taking effect as of May 4th. They were just wondering if we could get access to these guidelines coming out somehow and where those will be available.
You can find them on Health Canada's website. You can just research them on Google. If you have a lawyer, your lawyer can share them with you and go through them with you. The legal advice that we provide is to ensure that they're taken into consideration with the agency and in the contract, and we provide legal advice to our clients with respect to them.
Great. The next question I have here is regarding sperm donation. They were wondering if you know what kind of testing is available for sperm donors and if they should be doing this through their GP or an agency, and what tests specifically should they be doing to see if they would make a good candidate for making the embryos.
Sure. So if you mean genetic or becoming a sperm donor to other people, there is one sperm bank in Toronto, and it's at the Repromed Fertility Clinic. You can just Google them. If you're talking about using your own sperm to create your own embryo to, along with an egg donor, absolutely connect with your GP, or we can have you booked in for a consultation by Skype or Zoom with a fertility doctor who will send you requisitions to have a semen analysis done, along with any other testing that would be required.
Wonderful. We have a question here from someone who's interested in egg donation. They're wondering if they need to be finding their own fertility lawyer, or if that's something that Egg Helpers can help them with.
Egg Helpers absolutely can help a donor locate a lawyer. However, it's really important that for anyone watching this webinar that, no agency can require that you speak with a specific lawyer. The only time that you may not have the lawyer that you're interested in is if the intended parents are working with that lawyer, or if there's some type of conflict. However, if you're listening to this webinar and you wanted to connect with Cindy and you're a donor, that's fantastic. Cindy would take great care of you. If you're listening to this webinar and you're an intended parent, talk to Cindy. She'll take great care of you. Lawyers in this field work for the best interest of three people, and it's the egg donor, the intended parents, and the child that will result. And it's so important that anyone that you connect with understands, whatever it is that you need in a contract, as long as it's legal and something a lawyer can put into a contract. If it's important to you, it's important to Cindy, it's important to us at Egg Helpers, or whatever agency you're working with.
And I've also produced a document that summarizes the expenses for the donor and the law that Leia has, that donors can, if they feel comfortable, the agencies can give to potential donor to review in advance, so that they go into the process having some background before they get to the lawyer, which is often not until the contract process, which might be after screening. And so in the interim, it might be of comfort to have a prepared document that's quite general in nature and not meant to be absolute legal advice, of course, but somewhat in the nature of what this webinar is, or what I might speak to in a crowd of lawyers and other people.
Okay, great. This question I think expands on that a little bit more. They're wondering, upon completion of a fresh donor cycle, can you ask the donor agency for a log of all of the donor transactions and receipts? Is that something that they would have access to? They've been told by a previous agency that it would just be a flat fee and they wouldn't be able to see that. So they're just wondering how can they protect themselves during this process?
So I'll start by saying that the legal aspect of that is found in section 12 of the legislation that we have, which didn't come into enforcement yet. So as of now and until June 9th, there was actually no mandatory legal requirement in Canada to have receipts. It was best practices, and most lawyers would advise agencies to have them. But as of June 9th, there must be receipts. And in fact, the regulations also require that the agency or the person who is reimbursing maintain those records for 6 years. And so if it's a private donation and you're reimbursing your own donor directly without an agency, you will be required to keep receipts for 6 years as well.
And further to that, you know, most agencies, I haven't heard of a flat fee. I've heard of an estimate, a cost estimate, based on either a donor's previous donation or sort of the amounts that we would say are a general amount, and with any remaining funds returned to you. In terms of receipts or pay stubs, absolutely. I mean, there's definitely information that would need to be redacted, and you know, assuming it's an anonymous donation. However, you know, receipt is defined as, you know, is defined as someone writing down what their expenses were and signing it, and so often we will in turn send intended parents a spreadsheet that notes what her expenses are. We will take off any information, you know, from a pay stub, including her name, social insurance number, you know, any of that type of thing. So I know it can be quite frustrating for intended parents who may be under this impression that we see very commonly of, well, I'm going to write off my donor's expenses on my taxes. It's not a thing. You will get audited. Don't bother. You know, reimburse her for her expenses. Put it in a file far away that you know you can never give to your accountant, because we know, and Cindy, you may want to talk about this, we've had this conflicting information year on year. However, we have found year on year that every accountant we speak to tells us the same thing.
Yeah, I'm neither an accountant nor thankfully a tax lawyer, no offense to anyone who may be, but I have my own accountant and tax lawyer, and I went through the process myself. And as of now, you are not allowed to write off or receive any tax credit for the donor expenses. So a couple years ago, you may have heard lots of news about Revenue Canada saying that there will now be some tax credit or process available for those involved in this process and surrogacy, but it's related to the medical aspects. So the receipts from the clinic will be important, but you should really get proper advice from your tax lawyer or accountant. And if that accountant or tax lawyer contacted me with a legal opinion saying this will be used for the tax return, then I would happily speak to the agency and come up with some method that protected the privacy of the donor. But of course, one element of that is, you know, for you to consider having a known donor as well. But as of now, those expenses are not used for tax returns.
Thanks, Cindy.
Thank you. We have quite a few people asking if you could explain the timeline process, both on the donation side as well as the recipient sides. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the timeline for both of those.
Absolutely. So if you are a recipient and you have selected an egg donor who is fully screened and has either previously donated or hasn't, we will then send you to your lawyer to begin drafting a contract that outlines everyone's roles and responsibilities. We would identify you to the fertility clinic that you're working with. So the moment that COVID restrictions are lifted, they would be able to process your match sheet and information. And it would really be dependent on when your egg donor's next menstrual period shows up. Once that happens, she would be able to begin the process. And generally, it's about a 3-week time frame from the time of her period to the time of egg retrieval. Once the eggs are retrieved, they will create embryos with either donor sperm or your and your partner's sperm. And then depending on whether or not you're wanting to send your embryos out for genetic testing or to be biopsied, then you'd be looking at an additional 2 weeks. The embryos are, of course, are frozen and available for your use from any time after that. So generally speaking, we have many intended parents who move forward through this process quite quickly. So I would say, you know, a maximum of 10 weeks from match to having embryos available for your use.
And I think Leia and I did a webinar this morning with Dr. Liebrach from Create that should be out soon, in which he's also explaining what they're able to do right now during COVID. So he is conducting interviews by Skype or whatever means with donors right now to start the screening process. Medical records can be obtained. Requisitions of psychological assessments can be done by Skype as well. And requisitions can be granted right now to people to go to local labs to do blood work and or ultrasound. Not every lab will be available, but some are able to do them, so that we're actually seeing movement to some degree during this COVID lockdown.
Wonderful.
And of course, we can do the contracts.
Wonderful. For everyone else who has sent pretty detailed questions specifically for either Cindy or Leia, we'll make sure that we can get you in touch with contact information to go over that further with a consultation. And if you have any other further questions, do please let us know.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you so much, Jordan, for hosting today. And yes, you will get a recording of this webinar, contact details for Cindy or myself, and we look forward to connecting with you and following your journeys as you move forward in this amazing process, either as a donor or an intended parent. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.